Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, I thought we would spend some time talking about Christians' view of the arts, and that is something we've talked about here on Point of View, and I think you're really going to enjoy this hour in this conversation, because we have in studio with us Dr. Reg Grant. He is the chairman and senior professor at the Department of Media Arts and Worship at Dallas Theological Seminary. He's been teaching there since 1977, and as an individual that serves on the board of directors of groups like Insight for Living and a variety of others, we have information about him and some of his books and his website. And I've also even posted one of the conversations of the Table podcast on theology and the arts, some material that I thought you would find helpful, and you will certainly want to look at some of those videos. So, Reg Grant, just great to have you in studio.
Thank you. Good to be here, Kerby. Good to see you again.
I might just mention, too, my incredible debt of gratitude to you, because I was just thinking 4 of the 5 of producers we've had at Point of View over the last almost 2 decades have all come from the media arts program.
Oh, so that's great.
You have certainly been providing such an incredible number of great students. Now, the reality was, until we get to Steve, who I'm going to introduce in just a minute, they all came for about 18 months and then went somewhere else. But I felt like I was sort of the finishing school for some of them, but nothing else. You have done such a great job in the media arts program. Let's talk about that for just a minute, because it's something I would hope some of our listeners might want to participate with.
We started the media arts program a number of years ago at DTS because there has been and continues to be such a demand for artists of different stripes in the local church. So our heartbeat is really for the local church and to provide media specialists in that environment. We have some who are like Naima Lett, who has gone out to L.A. as an actor out there. She is discipling young actors and providing scholarships. And she was sort of on the side of the ledger of the person who's going to go out and hang out their own shingle and do their own thing. And she still does church work, but her primary professional occupation is as an actor and in training other actors.
Very good.
She's with Let's Rise, and it just does a wonderful job. So we have a bit of a split between those going into local church ministry and those going into more of the secular environment, but with a Christian worldview.
So again, we have information about that on your website. We also have your website and DTS and all the rest. And of course, one of the individuals that we are so blessed to have is the producer of Point of View, which is Steve Miller. And of course, you were the one that suggested him. And this has been a great opportunity for us to not only have him produce this program and understand all that, but gives him enough of a basis so they can go out and do some acting. So Steve, it's just great to have you on this side of the glass once again.
Well, it's great to be here. I appreciate including me. And let me voice my debt of gratitude to Reg Grant as well. It's mutual admiration society here going on. But Reg has meant so much to my wife April and I over the years, and taught me a lot about how to do what we do as actors and as believers. And something you and I talked about the other day, Reg, was this idea that you mentioned of Jesus representing the Father and how we as artists represent or represent him. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think when students come to DTS in the arts program and they're looking for, they aren't really looking for us to teach them from ground zero how to act. They're looking for a good biblical and theological foundation for their acting. So, most people wouldn't think, most people would wonder what in the world does acting have to do with representing God? And it has a great deal to do with representing God, because most people have a bit of a faulty understanding of what real acting is. Acting is not putting on masks. The best acting is removing masks, removing your own, and then surreptitiously removing the mask of the audience so that they become vulnerable and impacted by the truth you're trying to present. The Lord Jesus did that himself. There are a number of passages where in the book of John, most of them contained in the book of John, where the Lord says that in John 5:19 and 30, he says that he could do nothing on his own initiative, only what he saw the Father doing. In a little bit later, he says that he could say nothing on his own initiative, only what he heard the Father speaking. You put those two things together, and it sounds like Jesus was the most unoriginal man who ever lived, because he never did things independent of the Father. There's a kind of a binding principle in all of Western art that is the name of it is mimesis. Mimesis. Yes. And it means basically the way that Aristotle and Plato used it. It means copying or representing. But here's the distinction theologically: not representing in as if Jesus were in the carpenter shop of his earthly father Joseph, and Joseph says, "Hey, listen, son, here's how you shape wood, or here's how you frame stone. Now you do exactly what you see me doing." And Jesus copies him doing that. That's not mimesis, not theologically. It is more the idea of a mirror. If you look in a mirror, who moved first? The person in the mirror or the person initiating the action? Well, they're the same. They're inseparable. There is no time lag. So when Jesus represents the Father, he does it as if in a mirror, as if seeing the Father and Jesus' actions are one and the same. So much so that in John 14, when he's talking to Philip's a kind of a backseat guy. He doesn't talk a lot, it's sort of the last night that they're together. This is right before the high priestly prayer in John 17. And I can imagine Philip sitting back there saying, "Boy, I really should say something to impress the master. What could I come up? I know. Hey, Lord, just show us the Father and it'll be enough." And Jesus looks at him and he says, "Philip, have I been with you this long, and you don't know if you've seen me? You've seen the Father." Not the same person, but a perfect representation of the Father. And then Jesus prays for us in 17 to be able to do the same thing in the world, representing him to the world. And he gives us this wonderful ministry of the Holy Spirit that shapes us into the character of Jesus Christ and allows us to share that with the world. So when the people see us, hopefully, Lord willing, they will see Jesus at work in our lives and be drawn to him.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Dr. Reg Grant in studio with us today, and Steve Miller. We also have a link to your website, so we're going to talk about that a little bit later, and also some great material that you may want to take advantage of. And I hope this is an encouragement to some of you that maybe would like to use your artistic talents in one way or another, and also might encourage you to find out more about the Department of Media, Arts, and Worship at Dallas Theological Seminary, because that is certainly a place where you get some more of that training, at least to understand the theological basis for some of these issues in the arts. So let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover. If nothing else, you learned a little bit more about what mimesis means, and we'll talk about that and much more right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
For the next 2 days, I want to talk about the expanding role of big tech in the midst of this pandemic. Today I want to focus on surveillance and privacy. In other countries, the citizens have been willing to submit to increased surveillance. In South Korea, the government has used credit card data, cell phone location data, and surveillance camera footage to track citizens. They even announced that infected individuals might be required to wear electronic wristbands. Rachel Bovard thinks it is unlikely U.S. citizens would tolerate such intense and mandatory measures, but that's where big tech comes in. Seton Motley noticed something when he reread George Orwell's book 1984. Orwell's fictional government was extraordinarily competent in its totalitarian imposition of technological power, but no government is that competent and would need help. Enter private sector big tech. Google has already been sharing aggregate user location data with governments. Cell phone companies have developed tracking apps for their phone. Databases are collecting everything from GPS location data to medical data, and government bureaucrats and medical personnel have even talked about creating immunity passports. You know, Americans assume that they have some level of security of their personal health data. That is supposed to be protected by HIPAA, the nation's health privacy law, but the Department of Health and Human Services announced that it might relax enforcement of this law. You know, often a crisis changes our attitude towards privacy. After 9/11, Congress passed the Patriot Act that authorized massive surveillance of Americans. One security expert commented that the effects of COVID-19 will be more dramatic than the effect of the terrorist acts of 9/11. What may have been unreasonable a year ago might be set in motion if we don't resist this dangerous trend. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again as we talk about kind of the theology of the arts, and if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, or just simply sit back and listen as we are privileged to have in studio with us today Dr. Reg Grant, as well as Steve Miller. We have a link, first of all, to myunderstudy.com. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Also, I just posted one of the mini videos that comes from Dallas Seminary on the Table podcast, that one on theology and the arts, but there are so many others that you can learn from as well. And if in some respects you have an artistic talent of some sort or another, we want to encourage you and even talk about this. But Steve, I think we were talking about mimesis just a minute ago and mirror, but I think we have some other very obvious questions to ask.
Yeah, first of all, I just so appreciate the richness that you bring to this, Reg, with the biblical base out of John, and the idea of reflecting the Father. And, you know, there's nothing new under the sun. Mm-hmm. And centuries later, a millennia and a half later, you know, William Shakespeare wrote in Hamlet, when Hamlet is giving the speech to the players, he talks about holding a mirror up to nature. Okay, you mentioned mimesis, and we hold a mirror up to nature. And you and I have talked about that, and you had a nice addition to that, kind of a fine-tuning or a tweaking or a further understanding of what that looks like to us as believers. Could you elaborate?
I think the advice that Hamlet gives to the senior player, and it's the guy that runs the company. So this is a man with experience, and Hamlet is giving him all of these directions as to how to play the part. And the best that I think the world can do is to hold a mirror up to nature, like Hamlet said. If I hold a mirror up to nature, I'm reflecting reality as I see it. Right? And that's honest, and that has integrity, and that has a certain degree of authority. But I think that the Christian artist, whose job it is to represent God in life, as well as characters on a stage, can do more than hold a mirror up to nature. Our goal is to reflect the Father and Jesus Christ, so that what happens with a person is that we open a window into heaven. We help our viewers, our audience, see what they can be, not what they are. Sometimes that's not a real pretty picture, but what they can become only in Christ, and only as God's Holy Spirit reframes that person into the image of Jesus Christ. So I think that, oddly enough, kind of ironically and paradoxically, the way to discover your real uniqueness as a created being is to reflect the one who created you. And in that representation, we discover that which is truly unique to our character that he has created in us.
So when you look at a story that leaves you kind of hanging at the end, and there's a lot of great films out there and great stories that at the end you wonder, but what now? Like, it may paint a fairly bleak picture, but at the end, when we as Christians view a story that seems to have I'm a fan of Flannery O'Connor's. People who know me will attest, right? So at the end of some of her stories, A Good Man is Hard to Find, for instance, it doesn't end well. So what about that? And she was a believer. So what about that can we look at and say, this is how to open the window into heaven past that?
Yeah, I think that, I wish that one of my colleagues were here with me. I work with a gentleman named Dr. Tim Basselin down at Dallas Theological Seminary. He did his doctoral work on O'Connor.
Oh, wow.
And we have some good, oh man, this guy is great, and focuses on disability studies, because O'Connor was afflicted with her own disability and a lot of pain in her too short life.
Yeah.
When you take something like A Good Man is Hard to Find, which is pretty doggone dark, and you end it the way that O'Connor ended it, she doesn't wrap it up with a bow.
Right.
It is reality, but it is one of the three essentials that inform our view of art: goodness, beauty, and truth. Now, O'Connor's focus in that one is on truth.
Right.
But in that truth, there are possibilities, there are avenues to explore in terms of really getting into a character and understanding a character, that character's motivations, and what are the possibilities that have been missed along the way.
Right.
And so that invites us to examine our own character and see possibilities in our own lives that maybe we are neglecting or haven't seen or have been obfuscated by some besetting sin or weakness.
You mentioned Naima, our friend out
Naima
in L.A., Naima Lett, who I worked with. I just the other day watched a short film that she and I had done together.
Oh, really?
Forever. Mike Madden did the EDOC Festival.
Oh, really?
Remember that? The short
sure.
film festival, the Eighth Day of Creation Film Festival. She's out there doing some things that some would say, well, you're not doing Christian work. I mean, we use the phrase sometimes wrongly, I think, Christian as an adjective. We use the phrase Christian art. And the assumption can be that once you become a Christian, if you're an artist, if you're a singer, if you're an actor, if you're a painter, you need to do Christian/sacred work. Okay, and I think that gives us a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to represent. So, can you elaborate on that? In other words, why is it that that we as a culture think that that's the way it needs to be?
Yeah.
Well, you're a singer, you need to go to contemporary Christian music. You need to do gospel. If you're a painter, you need to paint biblical themes. We know that's not true, right?
Right. That's. I think that we need an adjustment to our understanding of what sacred means.
Yeah.
Everything is sacred. If the intent behind it is to glorify the Lord, then our work is sacred work. Whether you're a plumber or an electrician or a gaffer on a set or an actor, your work is sacred because it is set apart to the glory of God. And it doesn't have to be the subject matter that I deal with. It doesn't have to be so truncated. It doesn't have to be so narrowly defined as to be what pejoratively perhaps we would call stained glass. It doesn't need to. I don't need to put a Bible verse on a beautifully painted mountain scene in order to justify it as art. It is art because it is beautiful and it corresponds to the beauty of God who inspired that art. So as I am acting, as I'm living out my life, as I focus on Philippians 4 and goodness and beauty and truth and all of the long list that's there in Philippians 4, things that I should be meditating on, then in that way, regardless of what I'm doing, regardless of the particular action, and I'm assuming not doing anything that would be, prohibited by the Bible. Mm-hmm. But if our goal and our calling is to represent Jesus Christ dressed like a mechanic or dressed like an actor, then that's good, and that's beautiful, and that's true.
We interviewed Bruce Herman a week, 2 weeks ago. I lose track.
Yeah, just recently.
Up in Massachusetts at Gordon College. And as we were talking, I'm going to quote again one of my favorite quotes from that I first read in Steve Turner's book Imagine, and it's a quote by T-Bone Burnett, and he said, "If Jesus is the light of the world, I can write songs about the light, or I can write songs about what I see by the light." He said, "That's what I do." So I think some of that relates to what you're saying there. We write about the things that we see because of our relationship with Jesus.
Yeah. Do you remember that C.S. Lewis quote? You remember the C.S. Lewis quote about viewing down the beam of the light?
Yes.
I can't remember it exactly. We'll have to look that one up, but it's exactly what I thought of. It's that similar thing, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think walking in the light is the best way to be a revealer of the light. As we are conforming or allowing God through His Spirit to conform us to the image of Christ, we become light bearers, and that's the joy of it.
Yeah. Let's take a break, and when we come back, let me just encourage you during the break to go to a couple of the websites we've provided, myunderstudy.com, wordshaper.net, dts.edu, and a variety of others, because those are all resources that you can benefit from some of the work of Dr. Reg Grant. And we'll see if we can find that C.S. Lewis quote in just a minute, which we've used on more than one occasion, even on this program as well. And when we come back, we'll get into a couple more aspects of how to think about truth and beauty and art and all sorts of different aspects of that, and it's just a great opportunity to have Dr. Reg Grant in studio and Steve Miller. And for many of you, you have a chance every once in a while to talk to him when you call in, but now we get a chance to see him in studio once again. And we've had a couple of these great programs on the arts, and if you have a young person that maybe is thinking about wanting to use their artistic talents for the glory of God, we wanted this particular conversation to encourage them, but also maybe point them in some directions where they can find some great information about that and really develop a Christian theology of the arts. So let's take a break. We're only half done, and we have a lot more to cover, but let's take a break. And if you would like to join the conversation, you can call us, 1-800-351-1212, or mostly just sit back and maybe visit some of those websites, which we'll talk about right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation with Dr. Reg Grant and Steve Miller about a Christian view of the arts. One of the things we have on our website right now, and I encourage you to go there, myunderstudy.com. I mentioned a minute ago word shaper, but now that's all subsumed under that. So I'm a few hours too late, and all of that can now be found at myunderstudy.com. Talk about what's available there, because you have some great resources.
Oh, thanks. We have had such a great time putting My Understudy together. Just a brief history of My Understudy, how it came about. I have traveled with Dr. Chuck Swindoll for since about 2000, maybe 2001. And over the course of those years, I've been taking Bible characters. Chuck and I sort of do a tag team thing. He preaches, and I'm sort of the dancing monkey and come out and do my little bit of acting and present biblical characters. And over the years, people started saying, hey, can we get those? And until now, there was no way to get the characters that I presented on tour. So on location in Israel and so on. So we decided to put together 10 of them to start out with. And my sons, Gabe and Nick Grant, were kind enough to come down and shoot them in video them, and then edit them and add the music, all that kind of thing. So we designed myunderstudy.com with the great help of Marcus Raven. He's my web designer and good friend and former student from the program.
Yes.
He put this together and did a wonderful job, and people can go to My Understudy now and access all 10 characters, plus Bible study guides for leaders and Bible study guides for students, with tons of links embedded in those resources. And for the next, I think it's the next 2 weeks, you can see a countdown clock if you go to myunderstudy.com. We're going to give a 50% off offer on that for the next couple of weeks. So go now and plug in, and hopefully we'll get some feedback from you and find out how we can make them even better.
Well, and again, just a great opportunity for people that have always wanted to do that, because I've seen individuals going into character. Some do it better than others. Reg, of course, at the top of the group there. But again, just to have a chance to look at some of these characters like Barnabas and Esau and Jabesh and John and Patmos and Jonah and Joseph and Peter and Simon and all those. It's just really great material. So thank you so much for making that available. And Steve, I would imagine some of these churches that are looking for something that they could use will benefit tremendously by what is available at myunderstudy.com.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you've been listening and you think, oh, this is theoretical and academic, and man, it's very practical. And I watched you do that monologue, the Esau monologue on the website, and I've known you for years, 20 plus years now, and I thought, wait, is that Reg? So you did.
Who is that guy?
You did a great job as a dancing monkey, much better than a dancing monkey, I think. So Esau was it was fabulous. So it's very practical stuff. This is where the storytelling comes to life, where holding the mirror up to nature and opening the window into heaven, that puts on shoes, where the rubber hits the road, whatever metaphor you want to use. And so I appreciate what you're doing there. Just because I had to look this quote up finally, the C.S. Lewis quote we were trying to come up with. Yeah, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. I think T-Bone Burnett stole that, but it does let us know that is what our job as Christians in this arena is to reveal things like that.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, I think that. Oh, by the way, I should credit the reason that you didn't recognize me right off the bat is due to the great work of Gigi Coker, who has been my makeup artist for
it's really impressive.
Decades.
I look at some of these and go, that just cannot be you.
Oh boy,
There's no way
I looked in the mirror and said the same thing.
Yeah.
It's sort of like getting up in the mirror this morning and saying, "Oh, what's that? What's?" But I really, really appreciate the work that Gigi has done, and she's been with me for a long time and does great work. Yes, I think that the idea of living this idea of living in the light and being light bearers is one that frees you up. It doesn't restrict you. It gives you the freedom to explore goodness, beauty, and truth, and you find truth in the most unexpected, unanticipated areas. The character that you mentioned, Esau, was such of all of the characters that I've done, and I'm maybe around 30 different characters total that I do. Esau was the biggest surprise. I found something in that man's character in researching him that stunned me, and the elements of grace and forgiveness and rough around the edges. Yes, indeed, no doubt about that. I would not want to meet him in a dark alley. But the work that God did in his life later in his life is pretty remarkable. And that's part of what we bring to the table when we're examining these characters. Each character has something surprising about him that we weren't quite prepared for, and that helps us live our life in a more beautiful way.
Mm-hmm. Well, and in some respects, when you think about this, the Old Testament is character studies. You really don't know a lot about the New Testament disciples. You know that, well, I guess we have to say that Simon Peter was married because he has a mother-in-law and things like that, but you really don't know much of anything. But, boy, you can really see the broken branches on your family tree when you go through the book of Genesis, can't you?
Yeah, you really can. There are numbers of people in the Old Testament even in the New Testament, who have no given name, and yet they play important roles in the gospel, in the preparation for the gospel, in serving a king well. The Jabesh hero, who has no given name in Scripture, and yet he was one of the bravest men, not a soldier, just an average guy, but he did the right thing, and that inspires us to do the same.
You said something about Esau that was so fascinating. And we talked on the break about those discoveries, especially with Esau, and feeling the sympathy and feeling that sort of, I get in a sense, it's beautiful. It's grace that you see that you didn't expect. As an actor, I know you've been there, and we get these rare times, I think, on stage where we begin to grow and connect as the piece is progressing, as the play is progressing. And I think it's a beautiful analogy to our lives. We think we know, right? We think we know this character. We think we know the word. We think we know the story. And then as we are living it out, we come into these realizations of, oh my goodness, this is what it is, or I never thought of it this way.
Yeah.
It's a little bit frightening sometimes when you hit that moment with a character on stage in the middle of a performance. But it does, in a sense, lift you beyond the character.
And isn't it amazing that it always happens, even when you're doing solo work, which I don't have the joy of working with other actors usually. Usually it's solo work up in front of an audience. It happens in the context of community. Even when you're doing solo work, it happens when you give, and you're not just a giver, you are somebody who is creating this kind of synergistic loop with an audience, and they respond. Yes. So you've got this conversation going, and as they respond, you discover something that was not previously discovered before. It's a surprise, and it's due to the involvement and the participation of the audience. We cannot allow the audience the luxury of observation. If we do, they'll applaud and they'll say, "Oh, great, that was a really nice performance," but they will not have been involved. Yep. If they participate, if we're conversing with one another, then lives get changed.
Yeah, we engage them. Yeah, and that's why every performance can be different.
Yeah,
right. And you discover and you learn and you grow.
Never
every
dip
time.
your toes into the same act twice. The same way, never.
The same way,
like the old proverb. You never dip your toes into the same stream twice.
Right.
Even though you're in the same place doing the same thing, it's a different river. It's the same thing with every single performance. That even though you've done it how many times?
Yeah. It's fascinating. And if you're on Broadway and you're doing hundreds of shows, this becomes a challenge. You
got to keep that perspective.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, let's take a break, but let me just mention that as you go to that website we just talked about, myunderstudy.com, we have a 3-minute video that you can watch there of you playing Esau. So if you say, well, I wonder what that looks like, well, you can actually see that. And if you'd like to encourage people to find out more, you can also hit that share button, and you could actually put it on your Facebook page or your Twitter feed, and people go, where did you find that? And so that might also help educate some other individuals, especially, wasn't it still 50% off? Hasn't changed in the last few minutes. So that's just a great opportunity for you to find out a little bit more. We have a lot more to cover, but we have, again, one of those mandatory breaks. We are in studio today with Dr. Reg Grant and Steve Miller, who's the producer of Point of View, and 2 actors in front of me here, and it's just been great to watch that conversation unfold. But we need to take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue that conversation. But I would encourage you to go to myunderstudy.com, maybe watch that video, maybe post it somewhere, and see what kind of response you get. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. In studio with us today, Dr. Reg Grant and Steve Miller.
Yeah, Reg, we had talked about the tendency that sometimes we as Christians have to be rather isolationist in the way we view things. And you and I talked about Martin Luther, which you should know. You've done a little bit of research and written a novel on the guy. And you talked about the monastery walls. His background was he came from a monastery. He was saved out of that. what's the analogy? Elaborate on that analogy of the monastery walls and breaking those
Well,
down.
this isn't a new problem that we're facing. This idea of engaging culture, or dialoguing with culture, perhaps would be a better phrase. Back in the 16th century, I mean, Luther was if I'm remembering right, a conventual, a convent. Think convent, conventual. And the basic attitude was you keep the walls up, you keep the drawbridge up, and you go inside the convent or the monastery to keep yourself pure from the world. Well, the problem with that is you never impact the world.
Right.
If you're going to remain unstained by the world, and you keep the walls up, you're never going to have an impact on the world. So Luther, who bought into that, went to Rome to try to talk to the powers that be there to try to convince them that no, this was the right thing, because there was this movement called the observantist movement that countered the conventual movement. And while Luther was there conversing with his old mentor, Johann von Staupitz changed his mind. One of the few chances in the 16th century where I read Luther changing his mind about anything. And he said, this is right. We're going to lower the drawbridge. We're actually going to go into the world and still trust God to keep us unstained by the world, but share the light. Because if the walls are up, where's the light going to go? Light's going to come back on you. It's instead of sharing it with other people. So it's the same old problem that we've got. We fear contamination, and so we remain inside our cloistered walls and not visiting, not dialoguing, not risking sharing the gospel with people who are desperately in need of it.
Yeah, the culture, I think, tends to move in cycles. And back in the late 70s, with the movement of the moral majority and the far right, as it were, the religious right, which I heard someone once say that the moral majority was a response on the part of Christians who were angry that the world had stopped behaving like the church. Do you think? Yeah. Right? So sometimes we do tend to isolate, don't we? We tend to say, and we tend to also, I think, use art. Once someone is saved, okay, take this art, take this painting, take this song, take this play, and use it as a didactic tool. And it serves what we think is the greater good of the gospel, which is not always the case.
Yeah,
right?
Great art does not have to be functional.
It does
in order
not.
To be fantastic. It needs to represent goodness, beauty, and truth with integrity, and then trust God for the outcome of that. When students come to DTS and they enter the program, one of the greatest joys of teaching in this program is giving the student permission to be what God created them to be, because for so long they have been corseted and restricted in their expression. And we say, no, this is how God made you. This is a good thing. Now let's explore this together. And oh my goodness, to see that light come on, to see those students just explode out into the world and cross that drawbridge into culture and start revealing Jesus Christ. It's one of the greatest, what's kept me at the seminary since 76, 77.
You and I had a talk the other day, and you mentioned the work that you do at DTS, and you used that phrase, leaving a legacy, saying that as you progress, as you mature in your life, and you realize this increasing need to leave a legacy. What does that look like for you personally, and what does that look like for you there at DTS?
I think that all of us should be, who are in our age group, our more mature age group, should be thinking along with the younger generation. Millennials need to be thinking about this too. Yeah. With the kind of work that I'm going to leave behind, is it the kind of work that I want others to see, others to engage with, others to emulate in carrying goodness, beauty, and truth out into the world? Or is it something that's so ephemeral that it's basically nothing but a sort of a sanctified sitcom? That will pass away, and no one will remember what you did or why you did it 2 weeks down the road. We want to embrace the character of Christ, who is eternal, the same yesterday, today, and forever, and move forward into the phalanx of faith, getting out there in front and leading people to an understanding and an embracing of the Lord Jesus. That's what we want to do.
You showed a video to me, to a class when I was at DTS, and it was, I believe it was just called Acting Shakespeare. It was Ian McKellen.
Ian McKellen.
From the early 80s,
yeah,
right?
right?
And it was Ian McKellen doing a one-man show.
Solo work, right.
It was a solo job where he talked about, he gave a commentary on the work of Shakespeare. He played multiple parts. He addressed the audience directly. It was autobiographical. It was wonderful. And the thing that stuck with me besides the brilliance of that was afterwards, basically what you said was, dare we do any less in our preparation of presenting the gospel
Yes.
in that way?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. There's an album, believe it or not. I don't even know if it's on CD anymore, and CDs are going the way of the dinosaur, of Laurence Olivier reading the Bible. Now, anyone who knows anything about Sir Larry knows that there are perhaps he experimented with things that probably we would not want to experiment with. He's a brilliant actor, though.
Yeah.
And when he reads Genesis, and the Lord God is speaking to Cain after the murder of Abel, and he says in a little short line that's just, most people would just, it's a throwaway line, the three words of attribution, and he said. But when Olivier said, and he said, and he said. And you heard a wounded father.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that when I play that for my students, they just sit there with their mouths open, because how can a man who is not devoted to Christ, as far as we know, lend so much authority and empathy to the reading of "and he said"? If he can do it, as you said, Steve, then how much more should we who love Jesus want to do a good job?
Yes. Well, I wish we had more time, but we are out of time. But Steve, thank you for making this possible. And Reg Grant, thanks for coming in studio
It was a
today.
blessing as always. Kirby, thank you. Thank you, Steve.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Let me encourage you, if you've said, boy, that came pretty fast, or maybe you know somebody that would like to hear it again, we have an opportunity for you to actually download the podcast, and it'll also be showing up pretty soon on YouTube so that you can watch it or see it. And so maybe you'd like to listen to it again. Maybe you know somebody that would really be encouraged to think about how to use their gifts in the artistic realm. Or if they'd like to go to Dallas Seminary, you can go, it's dts.edu, right?
Yes, sir.
And find out a little bit more about the Department of Media Arts and Worship. So,
Yes.
Reg Grant, just been great to have you in studio. And thank you for providing all the producers over the years that you have,
You're
including
welcome.
this one that stayed around a little bit longer than the rest. So I hope that you have really enjoyed this conversation about the arts, and I hope that you will take the time to really apply this to your life in the future. Thank you for listening today to Point of View.
2020. Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you've been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is our Wednesday edition of Point of View, and over the next couple of hours here, we're going to try to cover a couple of things. First of all, I do want to talk about this bill headed towards a vote in the House, a $3 trillion additional bill, which is putting all sorts of debt on the back of your children and grandchildren, for those of you that have such. And also, this one is even more troubling than any one we've seen so far, because even as one commentator said, I think he was with The Hill, which is kind of the record that provides what's happened on Capitol Hill. One of them said, this is if you were to create a Saturday Night Live skit about all the progressive dreams all get packed into this $3 trillion bill. And yesterday, of course, we had Representative Van Taylor on, and he said, well, at that time he'd only read 15 pages. I took the time to look at least the first 100 pages, and it's just overwhelming. First of all, just all the number of times the word diversity shows up, and we're going to try to address the issue of hate crimes, and we're going to try to address the issue of environmental justice, whatever all that means, and we'll get into that in just a minute. And then you just see, 11 figure here, $50 billion here, $150 billion there, and another $30 million here. It just is overwhelming. And if indeed you are convinced that this is what we do to need to save the economy, then let's have a clean bill, not one that actually has every progressive's wish list. And we'll spend some time talking about that briefly. Don't want to bore you, but after all, it is your money. The vote's coming on Friday, although now there are some liberals, a number of people that are part of what's called the Progressive Caucus in the House of Representatives that say the bill's not liberal enough. And so they want to add some more amendments, if you can believe that. So we'll look at that. We'll look at a couple of other issues as well. We have some transcripts now that tell us a little bit more about what was happening behind the scenes with everybody from Adam Schiff to John Brennan, and we'll get into that. The Supreme Court had to look at an issue of the faithless electors, and I'll talk about that because this could become a big issue in the election. So there are a lot of things that we will try to cover in the first half hour today of this hour, and then the last half hour of the next hour. But in between, I want to talk with a few of our guests on education. That's kind of the theme for today. You might have remembered yesterday that we talked about the fact that Dr. Anthony Fauci really had some doubts as to whether or not the schools will actually convene in the fall, whether that would be a bridge too far, to use his phrase. And if indeed that is the case, and I'm not necessarily assuming that, but if indeed that's the possibility, then we're going to be talking with Lydia Kaiser about Child Evangelism Fellowship, some great material that they have if you want to educate your kids, whether you have kids in the public school, Christian school, homeschool. All of us are doing some teaching at home, and so I think you'll benefit from that. Jimmy Page will be with us the next hour. We'll talk briefly about instructing the next generation and some material that I think you're going to find helpful there as well. But let's get into it. They want to spend another $3 trillion on this relief package. It's a bill that is 1,815 pages. I've looked at the first 100 and can't even imagine what it must be like if indeed somebody wants to read every single page. And it is, as one individual said in one of the articles we posted here, matter of fact, the first article, kind of a grab bag of top Democratic priorities ranging from funding for food assistance, state and local governments, contingency plans, vote by mail, hazard pay for essential workers, and all sorts of things. The assumption is that there will be a vote on Friday, and it will probably be a vote along party lines. I just think in light of all the concerns that you can easily raise about this bill, that there is hard to imagine many, if any, Republicans in the House of Representatives voting for it. I would be surprised if all the Democrats vote for it, but they will probably be whipped into line, so we'll see. But then it goes to the Senate, and of course you've had the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and the White House that have said, really, we want to maybe call for a pause before really thinking about any additional relief legislation, because if nothing else, Congress should spend its time right now reviewing the implementation of some of the measures already put in place. And there have been some real concerns about the Paycheck Protection Program and the rest, so it makes some sense. And as I pointed out, it's possible that when we gather together on Friday for our Friday weekend edition with Kelly Shackelford and Penna Dexter, there may not be a vote because the Congressional Progressive Caucus actually sent a letter to the leadership yesterday wanting to delay the vote because they wanted to add additional amendments to it. This particular legislation as written right now would increase the maximum food stamp benefit and try to provide some more funding for local food banks, which, by the way, are actually very important and needed ideas. The trouble with a lot of these is to put very important and necessary pieces of legislation together with ones that have no basis of even being in the bill in the first place. This one also would add more money to you because it would also have a second round of $1,200 benefits that would be sent to you, up to a maximum of $6,000 for a household. For some of you, and I'm looking at a few of you that have kids that didn't qualify last time, you would this time, because actually all dependents would be eligible for payments if they're under the age of 17, which interestingly enough could mean some other benefits there as well. And, of course, those do have a particular topping out. If you make more than $75,000 as an individual, more than $150,000 as a couple, then you're not eligible for the maximum amount. It scales off in that regard. And one of the things I want to talk about when we come back from the break, well, let me put it on the table. It already allocates almost $1 trillion, $915 billion for state, local, territorial, and tribal governments, and that is to provide relief to some of these states. As we'll talk about after the break, the concern is this. There are certainly needs for many of these states which have drained their rainy day fund. No doubt about that. And maybe many states, state of Texas actually has a very ample rainy day fund. Some of them have nothing at all. But this also is exacerbated by the fact that many of those states that are calling for that have mismanaged, I think that's a nice way to say it, their pension funds. And so they're using this as a justification to bail them out of all the mismanagement of some of those pension funds as well. The legislation also provides about $75 billion. Every time you turn around, it's $1 billion here, it's $1 billion there. Adds up to real money, doesn't it? This would be for additional testing, contract tracing, and the rest. And then, as some people have pointed out, we need to do something for the Postal Service because, again, the Postal Service wasn't managed well before this virus. But as I'll point out in just a minute, the Postal Service has really been hit as hard as any of the government agencies because of the amount of printed mail has dropped significantly. And so a problem that already existed at the Postal Service is even greater. And we can talk about privatizing the Postal Service. Don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. Or we can talk about some kind of bailout. But if indeed there's a bailout, I think most of us would like to make sure that some reforms take place so that we don't have to come back and bail out the Postal Service once again. So let's take a break. When we come back, the second and third articles we're going to talk about also illustrate a couple bit more about some of the items in the bill. And also got a very good piece by the former Prime Minister of Canada about how some of this might force governments to shrink their size. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
For the next 2 days, I want to talk about the expanding role of big tech in the midst of this pandemic. Today I want to focus on surveillance and privacy. In other countries, the citizens have been willing to submit to increased surveillance. In South Korea, the government has used credit card data, cell phone location data, and surveillance camera footage to track citizens. They even announced that infected individuals might be required to wear electronic wristbands. Rachel Bovard thinks it is unlikely U.S. citizens would tolerate such intense and mandatory measures, but that's where big tech comes in. Seton Motley noticed something when he reread George Orwell's book 1984. Orwell's fictional government was extraordinarily competent in its totalitarian imposition of technological power, but no government is that competent and would need help. Enter private sector big tech. Google has already been sharing aggregate user location data with governments. Cell phone companies have developed tracking apps for their phone. Databases are collecting everything from GPS location data to medical data, and government bureaucrats and medical personnel have even talked about creating immunity passports. You know, Americans assume that they have some level of security of their personal health data. That is supposed to be protected by HIPAA, the nation's health privacy law, but the Department of Health and Human Services announced that it might relax enforcement of this law. You know, often a crisis changes our attitude towards privacy. After 9/11, Congress passed the Patriot Act that authorized massive surveillance of Americans. One security expert commented that the effects of COVID-19 will be more dramatic than the effect of the terrorist acts of 9/11. What may have been unreasonable a year ago might be set in motion if we don't resist this dangerous trend. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, just want to spend a little bit more time talking about this bill going before Congress, first in the House of Representatives. If for no other reason you'd like to know about it, it is your money, and ultimately you may want to contact your member of Congress about this as well. The second article I've posted here by Andrew Stiles, in which he points out that, as I mentioned just a minute ago, that as you read through this bill, the word diversity shows up 20 different times, which, with tongue in cheek, says, well, that is a reduction from the 32 times the word diversity appeared in the previous relief package put forward by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi in March. And it's a few hundred pages shorter, but there's still plenty, as he said, for progressives to be excited about. To put it in perspective, the word economy shows up twice in 1,800 pages. So you can see that this is all about social engineering as much as it is about economic issues. There's about $50 million for environmental justice grants to prevent, prepare for, and respond to the coronavirus. And you go, how does that relate? Of course, they're really stretching here to investigate or address the various disproportionate impacts in environmental justice communities, and you can figure that out. The word cannabis shows up 68 times. That would be marijuana, for those of you that aren't familiar with that. And oftentimes the word cannabis shows up in close proximity to the word diversity, which gives you a little bit of an idea of where this bill is going to take you. A couple of other things in there would be to change, this is supposed to be helpful for the fighting the coronavirus, to change the government's definition of minority depository institutions. Okay. And the bill would actually extend financial assistance to illegal immigrants by removing the requirement that recipients must possess a Social Security number. This was a provision that was put in by Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and a couple of the other members as well. And then the Progressive Coalition actually wants to do a lot more, and they are now proposing what's called a paycheck guarantee program that would cost about another $600 billion over the next 6 months, so that individuals would indeed get additional funding for that. That was, even though it is a liberal idea proposed by a number of prominent members in the House who are Democrats and part of the Progressive Caucus, actually was rejected by the leadership of the Democratic Party, which would be, of course, Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer and some others, in favor of a tax credit that would still cost $200 billion. So if you'd like to read more, I'm just giving you the highlights because I know we can probably move on to some other issues, but those are the first two articles that we've posted on the website. Let me then maybe try to answer this. Robert Verbruggen reminds us of the fact that there are some really important questions being asked here, and how to answer those are going to be important. And if you want to interact with your elected representative between now and Friday, you might do so. And the first is, how much money should we give to the states? Let's face it, some of these states have rainy day funds which are running dry. Many of the states don't have that and have not planned for the future. And so just as, unfortunately, a lot of individuals are being hurt right now because they had nothing in savings and nothing to draw upon, we have state governments that have done that as well. So in some respects, it doesn't make sense that a state that didn't do anything wrong should have to pay for this. And the only way it could pay for this ultimately is to raise taxes, which is not necessarily something that's going to get you reelected. And, of course, raising taxes on people that don't have a job, that doesn't work well either. So, in a sense, what they're doing is saying, well, let's have the federal government pay us. And the federal government doesn't have money because the federal government is $25 trillion in debt, but it just can print money, which is something the states can't do. So that's the tension. Do we want to provide that? Makes some sense. But here's the catch. Most of those states that are really in need of aid tend to be the blue states, which almost without exception are the states which have done a very poor job, and actually Verbruggen says a worse job, of managing their pensions. So do we bail them out for what they did in terms of mismanagement, in addition to what was not due to any mistakes or errors that they made in terms of policy? And that is a really good question to actually put on the table. The second one, of course, is what to do with the post office. As I pointed out, the post office has really been struggling, and even before the pandemic struck, they were actually hurting because, after all, a lot of you don't send letters anymore. You send emails, so that has always affected the post office. But now, about 1/3 of a decline in mail volume. That doesn't seem to be showing up in my mailbox. I think I'm on everybody's mailing list, and I just pull out this stack every day. But some of you have maybe noticed that you aren't getting as much junk mail as you were before. And so the reality is the United States Post Office will go broke, I should say, and actually drop off the table in terms of all the problems it's having right now by the year end. And so that's another issue. And then finally, what about the safety net? Because the concern in the past was when we provide all these additional benefits for unemployment, what we are doing is actually encouraging people not to work. How many times over the last couple of weeks now have we used examples of individuals that might have been making $600 a week will now be making more than $1,000 a week by staying at home? So why would a person who can make $1,000 a week leave home, actually get in some situation where they could hurt themselves in one way or another, and as a result actually take a pay cut? Which is also one of the reasons why some people are now talking about even providing hazard pay to people who go to work and might be around some kind of possibility of catching the virus. So nevertheless, a very important point to bring up. And just before we take a break, let me also mention the third article we've posted. This is by Stephen Harper. He was the Prime Minister in Canada, and yet even though he was the Canadian Prime Minister, He is an individual that oftentimes appears on things like the PragerU videos and a variety of others. And he points out, and I'll let you read it in its entirety since we're kind of tight on time, but he does point out something very interesting, and that is the assumption being made by especially the leftists, he says, is that this heavy investment into trying to help individuals during this pandemic will actually create larger government. And so as a result, people will start coming back and saying, you know, we need a bigger and wiser and larger government to actually protect us. He argues just the opposite, which I think he's right on, and that is a lot of people are going to see how economically ruinous some of the intervention has been, how the benefits that you get from the government pale in comparison to the benefits you would get if you were working in your job and actually had an opportunity to earn your living and to begin to grow your own wealth and begin to have a lot more economic freedom. And so he says before this is all through, what you're going to have are governments just simply not going to be able to cope with all of that. They're going to, as he says, have poor balance sheets. Various central bank actions will actually cause many of them to have to go into bankruptcy, whether it's companies, corporations, or even state and local governments. And so as a result of anything, I think it's going to push just the opposite for very significant kinds of austerity means in the future. Just think about right now, as your legislators get back to work, say in January, after you have elected them or reelected them, they are going to probably have to cut budgets because they might, in a few places, be able to raise taxes. But how do you raise taxes on some individuals who have been economically devastated in the first place? And so as a result, I think you're going to actually see a direction towards more austerity and more limited government. So we're going to take a break, and we come back at the next half hour. We'll spend some time talking about Child Evangelism Fellowship. Then we'll talk about instructing the next generation in the next hour. And then I want to come back to some of the other things in the news. We've had a couple of cases before the Supreme Court that I wanted to give you an update on. We also have all sorts of transcripts of the various interviews done by the House Intelligence Committee, which have demonstrated only so well that Representative Adam Schiff was misrepresenting that information from the beginning. Matter of fact, on Friday, I posted just one article that deals with that. We have some others that go into it in a lot more depth. So we'll talk about a couple of other important issues that you need to know about. But most importantly, I wanted you to probably get at least a little bit of an overview about a bill that is going to be voted on in the House of Representatives on Friday, unless it's postponed, and how it would actually add to the federal deficit an additional $3 trillion. This is like monopoly money. It's just amazing. But let's take a break, and we'll talk about what you can do to educate your kids and grandkids. All that coming up right after this.
When you gift a point of view, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
One of the things we've talked about here on Point of View is the need to really communicate to the next generation, which is one of the reasons why we from time to time do a millennial roundtable and talk about Generation Y, and now we've expanded that to also reaching out to Generation Z. And so over the next about half an hour or so, we'll focus on that younger generation. Next hour, we're also going to be talking with Jimmy Page about instructing the next generation. So just wanted to talk a little bit about education, and this is always important, but especially in light of what happened yesterday when Dr. Anthony Fauci was asked whether or not he thought we would actually have schools commence in the fall, and he thought that might be a bridge too far. Now, whether that happens or not, it is pretty obvious that there are resources that I think all of us that are looking for to educate the next generation, and especially as we come to our friends here at Child Evangelism Fellowship, are there ways that we can teach them Bible and Bible stories and biblical character and all the rest? And the answer is yes. And, of course, we've certainly depended upon some of these summer programs and some of these church programs for that. But while we're sheltering in place, we wanted you to know that there are a number of these COVID-19 resources for children. So if you go to our website right now, we have a link to Child Evangelism Fellowship, and the link right under Lydia Kaiser is the one that you can find, and she is the corporate communications specialist for Child Evangelism Fellowship, host of the short feature Teach Kids, which is produced by CEF, and has really wanted to reach out to this next generation, which we have oftentimes called Generation Z, and certainly have encouraged you to develop these good news clubs and various summer programs and all the rest. And so, Lydia, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson, and I really appreciate that introduction because we are quite concerned about Gen Z and how they are not being brought to church, so we have to go where they are and reach them in innovative ways.
Well said, because that's one of the concerns. Even when we talked about the Generation Y millennials, a lot of people said, well, they'll come back to church. And I'm saying the word back doesn't work very well because some of them never were in church in the
Right.
first place. And if that were as true for Generation Y, it's true even more so for Generation Z. And yet I am well aware of running into all sorts of young children who actually have become Christians, even though their parents never took them to church because they went to a good news club or there was a church outreach in which they had some kind of program. And so talk about what is available, because right now it's a lot more difficult to have any kind of summer program, a good news program, anything inside the church, inside the schools. And so you've kind of had to adapt like everybody else, haven't you?
That's right. CEF has been reaching 25.5 million children a year in face-to-face ministries around the world. But with the pandemic, that came to an abrupt halt, and we had to figure out how to do ministry differently. But God, praise God, He has opened new doors of opportunity, and possibly even more people are being reached through some of these different things that we're doing.
Let's, if we can, talk about some of the resources. I would encourage people right now to go to pointofview.net, or they can go to cefonline.com, but we've made it very easy with a link. And the first one that I wanted to feature is the Kids Draw the Bible devotional. And you got all these daily devotionals and an opportunity for young people to actually use their artistic talents. And so talk about that, because that's one of the resources that we are pointing people to today.
Yes. Well, if your listeners' children have not been in the habit of having a morning personal devotional time with God, this is a great opportunity. You know, someday they'll look back on this COVID-19 thing and they'll have nightmarish memories, or they can look back and think, well, that's when I first started a real relationship with Jesus. So we have devotionals that are different age levels, as well as homeschool resource Bible lessons that are on 3 different developmental levels to choose from, and an answer key for the parents. And so there's just a myriad of things for them to do while at home. But the first thing that we did in response to this whole crisis was start online Good News Clubs. And South Korea asked for it first. They begged for help, and so we got a manual written and over to them, which they started translating. And then as things began to hit here, we were able to just send it out to all of our local chapters. And it's amazing that attendance has actually, in some places, even improved. I was talking to one chapter last week. The children have invited their friends to join the online Zoom Good News Club. And so many children are attending that couldn't attend the live club before because they had to catch the bus home. They didn't have parents coming to pick them up. And so this particular chapter has started twice as many clubs, one at 3 o'clock, one at 4 o'clock. They're considering a 5 o'clock, and they're going on every day of the week instead of one day a week, even Saturday and Sunday.
So let's see if we can talk about, as people go to this website that we've been encouraging them to find, there's a Good News Radio and a Good News TV. So talk about how people can sign up and what actually is going to take place when they do so.
Okay, so for the Good News TV, it's kind of like children's church. You know, you have your online streaming church that so many adults are attending, unquote, and there's nothing for the children. So you can have your child look at their device and go to children's church when they would normally leave the service that you are watching online. Or you can have them participate in this children's church's Good News TV program when they would have normally been at a Sunday night or Wednesday night church program. So it's great for kids that don't have good internet to do the Zoom-type clubs. They can do this Good News TV. And then what was the other one that you wanted?
Well, I was just talking about Good News TV and Good News Radio because I didn't realize
the Good
you
News
had both.
Radio,
yes.
Yeah, is like a podcast, like a dramatized podcast. So they have the Bible stories as well as Christian living stories, missionary stories, and it's so important for kids to listen to missionary stories because our kids are in a culture that is very narcissistic, you know, what I'm wearing, who's liking my stuff on social media, me. And they need to hear stories about people who have dedicated their life to the Lord's work and who care about other people on the other side of the world and whether they've heard the gospel. So these are all really great resources for your kids to spend time on.
And it seems to me that, as I understand, the radio one is where you have some of your professional storytellers at CEF telling some of these stories, doing some dramatic material. And, of course, then, as you just mentioned, on the TV, that is an opportunity, Good News TV, to have some of this as well. So this is something that could fit very easily into your schedule. That could be the way you start up on morning. And as you point out, if indeed you are attending your church, and I say attending in quotes by going on Zoom or watching it online, online, you can have a separate program for your children or grandchildren. So in some respects, you're providing something that right now even the churches haven't been able to provide, and that is something I'm really excited about, because I would imagine most of our listeners are unaware of the fact that we can actually do a children's program simply by connecting up to Child Evangelism Fellowship.
That's right. Yeah, and I'd like to talk to you about some of the evangelistic resources that we have, to where these families can actually reach out to others in spite of staying at home.
Let's talk about that. We're going to have a break in just a minute, but it does seem to me that that's something that's always taken place with the Good News Club. And so let's maybe, if we can, take a break real quickly, and we'll come back and talk about that, because, again, we have a link right now for some of this information at Child Evangelism Fellowship. There's a whole section there on free COVID-19 resources for children. I mentioned one about Kids Draw the Bible, but then also we have one that is a Bible activity book that you might want to have access to. Of course, we're talking about everything from the Good News Radio to the Good News TV. And then if they would like, or you would like to maybe explain a little bit about this idea of the coronavirus, there is material on Stop the Spread and The Greatest Doctor and all sorts of other resources that might be helpful, even a stuck-at-home devotional. So these are some resources I wanted you to know about, because in some respects, especially as we head into the summer, there is going to be a need to have some kind of structure at home. And if indeed we do all get together again for school in the fall, and I have at least some questions about that, then this can still continue on. But if there is any kind of interruption in the educational process that some people are predicting might take place, these resources are going to be even more helpful. So we are just very indebted to Child Evangelism Fellowship. When we come back, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about how to use these not only to reinforce the faith in your children, but how can we reach out to some of the other kids in the neighborhood and share the good news with them as well. We'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Lydia Kaiser as we talk about what is available at Child Evangelism Fellowship. She actually is the corporate communications specialist, and we have a link to the website and just some great resources, which I would think would be very helpful to you. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Maybe you have a question about how to use this in your own community, or maybe you'd like to share something that you're doing to reach out to not only the children in your family or extended family, but in your neighborhood. And so let's, if we can, Lydia, for just a minute, talk about this evangelistic opportunity, because that's something that the Good News Club for years has been so effective in reaching young people at a very young age and telling them about Jesus.
Thank you. Yes. The first thing we have is a Do You Wonder Why booklet, and we developed this after the 9/11 terrorist attack because it speaks directly to children. It's narrated by children, the video version of it, about the emotions they experience due to natural disasters, illness, death of loved ones, crime, so on. And it talks about how it's natural to feel scared, sad, angry. It answers hard questions like, does God know and care about me? Why do so many bad things happen in the world? And how could God allow this to happen? And then after answering those questions, it guides the child in how to get through terrible circumstances, how to become part of God's family, how to receive God's comfort. And even adults are saying how much comfort they've received from this resource. So this booklet is now in PDF downloadable form. It's absolutely free. You can download it, share it with your friends. Grandparents can get on the phone with your grandchildren and go through it. It's cool because you click on the page and it goes swoosh and turns the page. And so you can pause and discuss it with the child and go through some of these things. And then we have two tracks. One is more evangelistic. It is called The World's Greatest Doctor.
Right.
It parallels the virus and how it keeps us from our friends with something even worse. That's sin, because it separates us from God forever. And it explains how Jesus is the world's greatest doctor and how we can try to wash away the virus, but we can know for sure how to have our sins washed away. And so that is a wonderful resource. Again, it's digital. You can download it. You can share it with others. And then there's another tract that's more for saved children titled Stop the Spread.
Right.
And it's talking about the spread of fear. So like popping soap bubbles when you wash your hands, it has 6 fear busters from the Bible to help keep the fear away. And it's really an encouraging resource.
Let me again just mention, that each one of those is free, first of all, because you've been mentioning that, but I don't think people still understand that they can go there. For example, Do You Wonder Why? You can go and download that right now. Of course, there's also an 8-minute video that you can watch. So there's both a video that's available and then the PDF, which is available for you to print out. So they're just all sorts of resources. And all of them are really pretty much geared for plug and play. You don't have to know much about it. Just start sharing it or start the video or hand the track, and you are almost ready to go. So in some respects, there's no need to learn something, go to a class, because in most cases, you can just take the material and use it immediately, can't you?
That's right. And we are having parents even go through this with their children, get their own questions answered, call our chapter directors. Oh, by the way, you can look up your local chapter when you go on our website. But we've had parents calling them saying, hey, we just watched the Good News TV Children's Church, and, you know, I have some questions. Then call back next week and say, hey, we just watched it again, and my son and I both prayed to receive Jesus as our Savior, or my daughter and I. And, you know, it's just, the stories are just really amazing how this is affecting entire families. One family, our director helped her to, because they had always been unchurched before, she helped her understand how they needed to have a devotional time every day, so they started the Stuck at Home devotionals. And then our chapter director invited her to attend her own online church service. So this family has attended church for the last 3 Sundays online, and will probably walk through the doors once the doors are open again.
Well, again, if people want to contact you, we have a link there where people can certainly watch some of the material, get involved, find out about the local chapter. Let me encourage people to donate to you because, of course, this has been a trying time for almost every nonprofit organization and certainly every ministry, because your ministry has always been used to and built on the idea of face-to-face communication and the good news clubs and all of the rest. And so I'm sure that in some respects there's been a financial need there as well. But if people say, I would like to get some of this material, but maybe I'd like to talk to you and find out if you can give me some more hints on how I can maybe develop one of these good news clubs in my neighborhood or have some kind of an evangelistic outreach. Is that possible for people to contact you at CEF and learn a little bit more about how to do that?
Absolutely. When they go on the website, there's a chapter lookup so they can find their local chapter. And they can coordinate with what their chapter is doing. Churches and families have even purchased bulk printed copies of the Do You Wonder Why booklet to distribute with food aid and other types of programs with their church. So there's just a lot of things you can do to reach out during this time. And people are so much more open during this time because of fear. So this is the time to talk to them about eternal life.
I would think so. Let me just mention one more time that we have information about all of these. Of course, we just talked about a minute ago, Do You Wonder Why? I think that'd just be a great evangelistic opportunity. The PDF is available, so it's free. There's a video that goes with it. We talked about a couple of those tracks, which I thought would be very helpful. The Greatest Doctor, as well as Stop the Spread. And then, of course, we've talked about some for the younger kids. Kids Draw the Bible and those devotionals, a wonder-free and wonder-fun Bible activity book, as well as, of course, what we were talking about during the last segment there, the Good News TV and the Good News Radio, and a variety of other homeschool resources if you're going to be homeschooling, stuck at home devotional, and much, much more. So if nothing else, you have just done an outstanding job, Lydia, of putting together some of this material. And as good as the material is, it's even more exciting that it's free and could be used instantaneously by anybody that's listening to this program and wants to begin to minister first to their children and grandchildren and then reach out to young people in their community. So thank you so very much for putting all of this together.
We have a great team here at the international headquarters in Missouri.
Well, again, it's just been great to have you on the program. So keep us up to date, and let's encourage everybody to simply go to our website, pointofview.net. You'll find a link there, or you can go to cefonline.com. Either way, that will be helpful for you. And so we wanted to give you some of those resources because you probably got kids at home right now, and you're saying, okay, what do I do? I'm trying to do what I can to provide some education. We are headed into a summer where, again, they're going to have a lot of free time. They've already had a lot of free time, and what are we going to do here? And if indeed the schools don't start in the fall, how are we going to think about all this, and especially to address these spiritual needs? So we wanted you to know about some of those resources, and they're all available, as we mentioned, at Child Evangelism Fellowship, and we have a link to that on our website, pointofview.net. Let me just mention that my Viewpoints commentary today is on big tech and surveillance. I may come back in the next hour to talk about that briefly, both today and then tomorrow. I'll talk about big tech censorship, two very important issues of how, as we are in the midst of this sheltering at home, big tech has really stepped up to, in some respects, cause us to lose some of our privacy, to surveil us, and to really begin to, I think about what we need to do and how we should respond to some of that. So that's the Viewpoints commentary that is there for you today. And when we come back from the break, I want to talk to Jimmy Page, who is a speaker, a writer, and trainer, and he works quite a bit as a leadership coach. Right now serves as the divisional vice president for Fellowship of Christian Athletes. We're going to talk about reaching out to the next generation. We talked about some of the young kids. How about some that are a little bit older? Generation X, Generation Y, Generation Z. How do we reach out to them? We'll talk about that with him right after these messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Welcome back. If you were with us last hour, we spent just a little bit of time talking with an individual with Child Evangelism Fellowship, just talking about the fact that if we really want to reach out to this youngest generation, the so-called Generation Z, we're going to have to reach out to them because they may not be coming to church in the first place. And so we talked about Good News Clubs and all the great resources available right now that you can use with your children and grandchildren, even do an evangelistic outreach. This first half hour of this hour, I wanted to spend some time looking at that in a little different way, and that is to talk about how to really reach out to this next generation, the so-called Generation Y, the millennial generation, Generation Z. We sometimes do a millennial roundtable where we talk about that, and we thought it would be really helpful for you to hear from Jimmy Page, who is a speaker, writer, trainer, and leadership coach. You may be familiar with his book, One Word That Will Change Your Life, of course, Life Word, and we also have a couple of other things we'll be talking about in just a minute. Individual that has served as the divisional vice president with Fellowship of Christian Athletes, just a real dynamic speaker. So, Jimmy Page, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Let's talk about reaching out to this next generation, because in the past, if you were a speaker, as you are, and a writer, you could assume all sorts of commonality, that maybe they'd gone to church, or even if they hadn't, they still grew up in kind of a Judeo-Christian culture. That's not the case. So whether you're speaking in a high school assembly, whether you're speaking to athletes that maybe stumbled into a Fellowship of Christian Athletes huddle or something like that, you got to really start from a different set of presuppositions, don't you?
You really do. It's a lot different today than it was even 10 years ago, you know. But I think the biggest thing for me that I've learned is to cast a really big net. You know, it's to make your message speak to something that they're experiencing right now, make it very attractive, let them know that you kind of have a little inside baseball. You know what they're feeling. You know the stresses or the anxieties that they're experiencing. You know their sense of a lack of purpose, which seems to be a common thread. When you know what's affecting them most, then you can talk in broad terms based on biblical principles that make it really, really attractive.
And it does seem to me that the thing they're struggling with right now is the pandemic, and that is the fact that if they're seniors, they're going, I missed my prom, I missed my graduation, this is such a raw deal, I can't believe this is happening. If they're younger, they're still going, you know, I really honestly want to be with my buddies at school, and I want to play games, and I want to excel, and instead I'm stuck at home, I can't be with my buddies. So it seems to me that that's a common point right now that you can actually reach them with, right?
Oh, there's no question. You know, there is a global disappointment. You know, there's a disappointment no matter where you are in life, but especially for the next generation who is, as you said, graduating from one part of life to the next, whether they're graduating middle school to high school or high school to college, or they're missing out on their sports seasons and they can't connect with their friends. There really is this sense of global loss and disappointment. And when you build your life on those things, like when your value, when your identity is in what you do or the friends that you have or the next adventure that you're going to go on, when your identity is there, you're likely to be disappointed over and over and over again. So we get to speak to, hey, could you build your life on something that's unchanging? Could you build your life on something that no matter what the external storm is that you're facing, whether it's a pandemic or it's a divorce or, whatever that thing is, could you build your life in such a way that no matter what you experience, that you can still have that peace, that inside peace where your internal condition is not dependent on external circumstances? So it's a wide open door because of that disappointment and anxiety.
And again, we just wanted to cover some of this so that you could begin to think about how you would communicate to not only your own kids or grandkids, but also the community and the rest. And Jimmy, one of the things we've done, of course, we could highlight any of your books, but one that we decided to highlight was Wisdom Walks, which is one that you've contributed to with Dan Britton and some others, 52 Life Principles for a Significant and Meaningful Journey, that came out just last month. And I thought we would want to feature it for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's a great kind of graduation present. It's something that you could certainly give to individuals like young people right now that are kind of trying to figure out their purpose and their meaning in life. And so talk about that, because it really provides some great devotional insight that would help them in their journey through life.
Yeah, when Dan and I were kind of journeying through life, we met actually my last year in college and his first year out of college. I was the leader of our FCA huddle, Fellowship of Christian Athletes huddle at Virginia Tech, and we brought him in as a guest, and that's when our friendship started because he was a pro lacrosse player. And then when I graduated, I ended up working just a few miles from where he lived in Northern Virginia, and we struck up a friendship and accountability. So we started to do life together. And what we decided was we really wanted to make the most of this opportunity. We both were followers of Christ. We both had tried New Year's resolutions. We both had, our long list of to-dos of the things that we wanted to accomplish. But as we started to do life together with the two of us and two other young men, we really focused on what could God make of our life if we fully surrendered it to Him, and then we walked through this life together, experienced it together. And all of these chapters are really biblical principles that come to life. They're the 52, we think, 52 of the core life principles that are going to hopefully help to transform you into everything God has designed you to be, so that you can live the life you're made to live and make the kind of difference for others that you're designed to make. So that's where all of the content for this book is a 20-plus year, 25-plus year relationship with Dan and others to distill God's truth for a real meaningful life.
Sometimes people say when I write a book, how long did it take you to write? Well, you're talking about the amount of time I sat on the typewriter. You're talking about the fact that I've been living some of that for the last 50, 60 years. So in some respects, that's the same kind of thing. Let me just, as we're taking a break here, come back and get into that a little bit more. But that's one of the things I wanted to feature today. First of all, I think you can learn so much from Jimmy Page just in terms of how to communicate to this generation that are still kind of trying to figure out their purpose in life and their meaning in life, and they're struggling with all sorts of difficulties. But I also wanted to feature today the book, which you might be able to find in your local bookstore, but I know a lot of you aren't even making your way to bookstores right now, so it is available both in imitation leather. So that's why I said I think it'd be a great graduation present for any young person, but whether they're graduating or just simply going through life, you can, of course, get it in Kindle as well. 52 Life Principles for a Significant and Meaningful Journey. And, of course, Dan Britton and Jimmy Page are the individuals whose names are at the front, but you have some others that are part of it as well. It's called Wisdom Walks, about 250 pages, some great material that we have featured today on the website. But if you also say, gosh, I'd like to know a little bit more about Jimmy Page, we have a link to jimmypage.us. And as you go there, you can find out more about some of the leadership material he has. Of course, some of the other books like One Word and Life Word, and some of those. You can see some of the notes and other material that is available, and might even want to have him come and speak to your group. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with Jimmy Page right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
For the next 2 days, I want to talk about the expanding role of big tech in the midst of this pandemic. Today, I want to focus on surveillance and privacy. In other countries, the citizens have been willing to submit to increased surveillance. In South Korea, the government has used credit card data, cell phone location data, and surveillance camera footage to track citizens. They even announced that infected individuals might be required to wear electronic wristbands. Rachel Bovard thinks it is unlikely U.S. citizens would tolerate such intense and mandatory measures, but that's where big tech comes in. Seton Motley noticed something when he reread George Orwell's book 1984. Orwell's fictional government was extraordinarily competent in its totalitarian imposition of technological power, but no government is that competent and would need help. Enter private sector big tech. Google has already been sharing aggregate user location data with governments. Cell phone companies have developed tracking apps for their phone. Databases are collecting everything from GPS location data to medical data, and government bureaucrats and medical personnel have even talked about creating immunity passports. You know, Americans assume that they have some level of security of their personal health data. That is supposed to be protected by HIPAA, the nation's health privacy law, but the Department of Health and Human Services announced that it might relax enforcement of this law. You know, often a crisis changes our attitude towards privacy. After 9/11, Congress passed the Patriot Act that authorized massive surveillance of Americans. One security expert commented that the effects of COVID-19 will be more dramatic than the effect of the terrorist acts of 9/11. What may have been unreasonable a year ago might be set in motion if we don't resist this dangerous trend. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Jimmy Page. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. And I thought we might spend some time talking about some of those life lessons, because one of the things I know that you do when you speak is to really provide some leadership direction for young people. And I think we've always had problems with really developing leadership skills in a generation. But that seems to have actually even accentuated more and become even more critical, because you have a good number of people in these younger generations, so-called Generation Y and Z, that have come from broken homes, maybe haven't had good role models, and so in some respects can really develop some of that leadership if they get involved in a huddle with Fellowship of Christian Athletes. They can really develop some leadership skills if you just take some time to pass on some of these principles, which most of us sort of take for granted. They're almost intuitive. But for the younger generation, some of it is just like new information, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. You know, what I found, though, is they're like sponges, because when they hear a principle that actually can benefit them, then they dive in. You know, they're all in. And I think one of the things that I usually start with is your mindset. It will largely determine the direction of your life.
Yes.
You know, we know in Scripture that transformation starts with the renewing of your mind, because we know that how we think and how we see things is going to largely determine what we do about those things. So, for example, you know, if I change the way I see something, then what I look at will eventually change. You know, do I see the current crisis that we're in, for example, as a problem, or are there possibilities through it? You know, is it a challenge, or is it a crisis, or is it an opportunity
yes.
to bring change, you know? And so if you can change your mindset and move from what I would consider a victim mentality, oh, this is all happening to me, and I could place some control back in your hands, and instead of a victim, you can take control of the things that you can control and decide that in the middle of crisis, you're going to come out on the other side better. And then you can go to work on what are the things inside of me that might need to change so that when I come out of this crisis, I'll be in a better position to handle any new conflict or any new challenge that I might face. And that's the type of leader we need, right?
And it does seem to me that when you're talking about this idea of changing your mind, another part of that is your emotions and your will. We've in the past talked about the book, The Coddling of the American Mind, and one of the guests on the program was one of the authors and points out that in some respects you have a generation now that really leads with their feelings. But I found oftentimes that if you can say, look, I'm going to do this, even if I don't feel like doing it, after a while my feelings follow. But if I always perceive the world through feelings, then I am going to be stuck in that victim mentality that you've mentioned, and I'm going to ultimately not see myself as coming out on the other side, but just simply lamenting the circumstances in which I find myself.
No question. Each one of us has a choice. We have a choice to approach the future through the lens of faith or the lens of fear. And I think you see it everywhere today. I mean, anybody you talk to, you can tell which perspective they see life just by having a 2-minute conversation about the challenge we're facing, right? So what I tell people is faith and fear they're cousins. They're opposite sides of the same coin. Fear has a negative expectation about the future. It's bad today, but boy, it's going to be worse tomorrow. That's fear. And faith says, no, I have a positive expectation for the future. And, when I think of examples in the Bible of that, I think of Joshua and Caleb. They, along with 10 others, went in to spy out the promised land. Moses sent them in, and he said, hey, tell me what it's like. Are we ready to go? And Joshua and Caleb were the only two that came back looking at things through the lens of faith. Yes. Everyone else came back looking at it through the lens of fear. And, of course, fear is wildly contagious. It's like rolling a ball downhill. If you can get a little bit of fear going, man, by the end of that hill, it became a full-blown panic. But that positive expectation, that faith-filled, courageous expectation, it spreads, but it takes a lot more work. So I always coach people, you've got to take control of the way you think because it does affect the way you feel. And as soon as you feel that fear, then it can paralyze you. But if instead you operate through faith, God's power, His presence, and maybe even some promises that are in the Scripture, if you operate out of that, then you have the strength to take courage, which is faith in motion, right? It's taking action in spite of fear. Hey, I can feel afraid. That's okay. But am I able to take courage with me? Am I able to take action even though things are scary? And that's why God encourages us over and over, be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous.
In the New Testament, too, of course, it says that God did not give us a spirit of fear, but of power and love and a sound mind or self-control. And when you're talking about the contagiousness of fear, it reminded me the other day we did an interview with Tony Evans, and he said, I think fear is spreading faster than the virus. And so in some respects, we need to address that. And one other aspect, since you were talking about faith and fear, what about anxiety? Because, we're told to cast our anxiety on the Lord in 1 Peter, of course, the famous verse in Philippians 4:6, which we've talked about with our friend Max Lucado about do not be anxious about anything. This whole idea of anxiety is something that we need to address as well with this generation, right?
No question. And, I look at my life and I look at times when I might have had worry and anxiety about something. And I thought, what was common about those things? What was common about those things was I would dwell on the negative potential. I would create in my mind and my heart the worst case scenario, and I would sit on it and think on that instead of, again, taking control of that thinking. And another thing that I did that I think is really powerful is motion creates emotion. And a lot of times with this generation, sadly, they don't move very much. A lot of times they're sedentary. They're in front of a TV screen or a computer or a phone, and they don't move. But what I've experienced is if you feel anxious, and you feel worried, if you will get up, go outside, if you're allowed to, hopefully you are, go for a brisk walk, do 10 push-ups, change your physical state to improve your emotional state. And I can't tell you how effective that is for this generation because they've never even considered that one thing is linked to the other.
So well said. Just before we run out of time, let's talk about what is on your website. We have jimmypage.us, and that's a place where people can maybe schedule you to speak or learn more about some of the other principles. We've also featured your book, Wisdom Walks, 52 Principles for a Significant and Meaningful Journey. So talk about some of the resources that are available, because I would like to have our listeners take advantage of them.
Oh, well, thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, I love getting in front of schools, leaders, corporations, businesses, you name it, because when you bring these principles into a leadership setting and you invest in the people that are influencing others, that's when you can have the greatest possible impact on others. So I'm passionate about that. I'm passionate about this idea of being strong enough to help others. You know, one of the principles in Wisdom Walks is having the strength for two. It's this idea that you push yourself beyond your limits, physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. You get outside of your comfort zone so that when you have an opportunity to help somebody who is in need, like right now, you are ready. You have an increased capacity, an increased ability to help others in need. So that's kind of part of my come from. And one of the books that's been really, really influential is that One Word That Will Change Your Life, where you narrow the focus around one single word and you watch how God brings life transformation inside so you can have a greater impact in your everyday life.
And again, that's on the website there, which again talks about one word that will change your life, and also all sorts of information about speaking, which again is at jimmypage.us. And so, Jimmy, thank you for joining us. And again, let's eventually get out of this sheltering in place so we can get you out there in front of all these audiences. And I appreciate you giving us some time today here on Point of View.
Thanks, my friend. God bless you.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about a couple of things. First of all, we now know a lot more about some of the investigation that was done that led ultimately to the impeachment of Donald Trump, and a lot of these documents having to do with Adam Schiff and the House Intelligence Committee have been released, and we found out that, I guess a nice way to say it is, he wasn't always telling the truth about some of this. And then we have a couple of cases before the Supreme Court, one that could actually affect the election that was heard today, another one heard last week. We'll get into those issues as well. And before we're done, we'll spend some time talking about my commentary today and tomorrow about big tech and surveillance and big tech and censorship. And those are just a few of the things that we've been talking about today here on Point of View. So I hope that you will visit the website, find some of these articles, find some of the links to Child Evangelism Fellowship, to Jimmy Page and the Fellowship of Christian Athletes and others. These are great resources that we want to put in your hands, especially while we are concerned about the education of the next generation. So that's why we do this here at Point of View. When we come back, we'll get into a couple more issues in the news, all that coming up right after this.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. One of the things that is starting to surface is how so many times Representative Adam Schiff has misrepresented some of the evidence, and that has surfaced because an additional 57 transcripts of the interviews that were conducted by the House Intelligence Committee, remember those done in the basement there, have now surfaced. Those weren't provided easily. As a matter of fact, they were only released once the White House threatened it was going to do it anyway. And, of course, you have to wonder if there were some that were left out. But if nothing else, we're seeing that to be the case. At the same time, there's all sorts of information coming out of the various investigations being done under the Attorney General's office, Bill Barr, under John Durham and others, which we'll get to in just a minute. And I've always kind of stayed away from some of that, one, because it's almost been a drumbeat for almost years now, or not almost, 4 years, in some of the conservative talk shows, talking about the deep state and what the president knew, that is Barack Obama, what John Brennan knew, and what all sorts of other individuals, Sally Yates and James Comey, were knowing, and all of the rest. And in some respects, I was, first of all, a little bit confused, because if indeed there was evidence there, you would think that more than just Sean Hannity and a few people like that would be talking about it. A lot of people simply dismiss that as nothing more than a conspiracy theory. And my argument has always been that, sooner or later, your sins will find you out. That is a quote from Numbers 32, verse 23. And it, of course, applies primarily to Moses and in the Old Testament. But there is the principle that oftentimes, eventually, truth will prevail. You can think of another example in Galatians 6, where the Apostle Paul says, "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. What a man sows, he reaps." And so if indeed there were individuals that were attempting to bring down Donald Trump, we'd find out about it. And that seems to be what is unfolding now. While a lot of the attention is focused on the coronavirus, the pandemic, and all of the rest, there are all sorts of documents now that change the perception that maybe we had just even a few months ago, and in some respects confirm some of the comments being made in a lot of these talk shows. And a good example of that appeared in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, in which they pointed out that, Americans expect politicians will lie. I don't, but I guess that's kind of what we expect now. But they said sometimes the examples are so brazen that they deserve special notice. Newly released congressional testimony shows that Adam Schiff spread falsehood shamelessly about Russia and Donald Trump for 3 years. Even his own committee gathered contrary evidence. This has to do with the 57 different transcripts of interviews that were done, actually there by the House Intelligence Committee. He has resisted making those available, but did finally have to release them because the White House said they would release them anyway. And the editors at the Wall Street Journal put it this way: now we know why. From the earliest days of the collusion narrative, Mr. Schiff insisted that he had evidence proving the plot. In March of 2017 on MSNBC, Mr. Schiff said that, I can't go into particulars, but there is more than circumstantial evidence now. In the December 2017 interview he did on CNN, he said the Russians offered help. The campaign accepted help. The Russians gave help. The president made full use of the help, and begins to make the Russian narrative, which, by the way, eventually blew up when Robert Mueller couldn't come up with anything that looked like this. And then, you, of course, have even back as late as 2 years ago, or almost 3 years ago now, actually, the former director of the National Intelligence Committee, James Clapper, told Adam Schiff and his colleagues, "I never saw any direct empirical evidence that the Trump campaign or someone in it was plotting or conspiring with the Russians to meddle in it." And then you also had all sorts of people then, once they were put under oath, saying, no, we really didn't have any of that either. And so then you have a whole parade of Obama officials, whether it is Susan Rice, Ben Rhodes, Samantha Powers, or whether it's even the former FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe, all going, really, we didn't have any of that evidence. And so that has changed rather dramatically. And, of course, we were always hearing the so-called Russia collusion. Now, another document has just landed, and that shows that the former CIA Director John Brennan actually had evidence from the intelligence community that Russia, if they wanted anyone to be elected in 2016, it was Hillary Clinton. And the reasons were pretty obvious. That is, they already knew who she was. She was Secretary of State. They'd already been able to make their peace with Barack Obama, and then with Hillary Clinton, they figured they probably would be able to do everything they would want to do with Hillary Clinton and had no interest in trying to figure out Donald Trump. Yet we now know that John Brennan, even though he had that information, suppressed it because it didn't fit the Russia narrative. And so as these documents begin to land, we learn a lot more every single day. Gary Bauer put it this way. He said, all you have to do is go back to one meeting, and that was on January 5th, 2017. This is about 2 weeks before that time candidate Donald Trump would be inaugurated as President Donald Trump. And this was a meeting actually pulled together in the White House. You have the FBI Director, James Comey. You have the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, who I just mentioned a minute ago. The CIA Director, John Brennan, who I just mentioned as well. National Security Advisor, Susan Rice. Also attending were a variety of other individuals, including Sally Yates, and most importantly, the presumptive nominee for the presidency, and that is the former Vice President, Joe Biden. And they decided that President-elect Donald Trump should be told about this Russian dossier that we've talked about, but they did not tell him that they knew it was debunked. And so they sent James Comey to do so, and he flew to New York, and the next day was at Trump Tower and told the incoming president, Donald Trump, about that. Once Comey told Trump, as Gary Bauer points out, the deep state started leaking. Days before the Trump inauguration, there were multiple press reports about an ongoing investigation as to whether or not the president-elect was compromised by the Russians. And if you look at that particular meeting, it is interesting because at one point, Brennan and Clapper leave, but Biden, Comey, and Yates remain. And that apparently is where then Barack Obama, former President Barack Obama, began discussing the intercepted call between Michael Flynn and the Russian ambassador. Now, almost instantaneously, the Deputy Attorney General, Sally Yates, did not know about the call and was surprised and shocked that Barack Obama did, which means that probably James Clapper or somebody told him about that. And so this meeting was, if nothing else, an attempt to see, I suspect now, looking back in hindsight, what can we do to use this against Michael Flynn? And, of course, we've been talking about that over the last week or so. And a good piece of evidence for all of this is that on Inauguration Day, this is as Susan Rice is leaving the office and people are then coming into that same office, one of whom is Michael Flynn. She spent her final moments in the Obama White House writing a CYA memo, cover your you-know-what, to herself, which uses the phrase, by the book twice. The memo appeared to be something to try to cover any tracks and make it clear that indeed President Barack Obama actually told everybody to do it by the book, do everything by the book, because maybe he didn't do it after all. And so we'll see where this goes, but if nothing else, up until now, there has certainly been a lot of speculative evidence of a deep state working against Donald Trump. There, of course, were the Russian collusion arguments being used time and time again, but this is the first time that we've actually had some basic evidence for it as well. I might just mention that before the Supreme Court, they actually had to consider this issue about whether or not you can be a faithless elector. Recognize that after the election takes place, these electors then go to their state capital and they cast their vote for who that particular state voted for. And there has been a real pressure over the last couple of years to try to force some of those electors to not vote the way their state votes. And so you had an example in Colorado, you had an example in the state of Washington. And so this is why the Supreme Court is considering this case, because it could affect the election this time. because you can imagine if you send your electors from California, New York, Texas, Iowa, Alaska, Florida, wherever, Georgia, and they then go to the state capitol, but they vote independently of how the state votes, you could actually have something that looks a little bit like a political coup. So even though this particular case before the Supreme Court didn't get a lot of attention, I thought I'd bring it to your attention because how they rule could really have an impact, and a very significant impact, not just on the 2020 election, but in elections in the future. So it's just one of those other issues that I wanted to put on the table for you to know about. When we come back, we're going to spend some time talking about big tech and surveillance, big tech and censorship. Those are some of my commentaries today and tomorrow. We'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Okay, for a few more minutes, let me just, if I can, mention why I think this idea of faithless elector is really important. And that is, as I mentioned just the other day, there's a very good piece that came out by Jason Kilmeyer, our endangered transfer of power. You got to recognize that we've had some pretty close elections. And for those of you that are under the age of, say, 35, you probably don't remember with any kind of recollection what happened 20 years ago, in which you had George W. Bush elected out of Florida by 537 votes. This required for the Supreme Court to meet in a case of Bush versus Gore, and it is something which, even though that was seen as a contested election, you had individuals saying he was an illegitimate president and all the rest, the American people sort of went along with it, even though there were the Michael Moores and others that certainly couldn't take that in any stride and complained about it. But now go from 2000 to 2016, and you have Donald Trump winning Michigan by, 10,000 votes? Donald Trump winning Wisconsin by 27,000 votes. Again, that's a lot more than 537, I understand, but that's very, very close. And it's illustrative, again, that if we have another set of close elections, you can see how there will be even more pressure being put on individuals to actually change their vote. Even during the end of the Clinton campaign, Hillary Clinton's campaign actually called for some of the members of the Electoral College to be briefed on the Russian-related intelligence, which I just talked about a minute ago, hoping that that might change some of their votes. And, of course, you have 2 states in which that actually took place. Now, we do have 32 states that require an elector to actually vote for the candidate he or she is pledged to. But interestingly enough, even in those states, Colorado and Washington, we had that. In Colorado, you had an elector who was going to cast a ballot for a different candidate. The Secretary of State removed him. And then when the electors did the same thing in Washington State, they faced a $1,000 fine. And the reason this case is before the Supreme Court is because the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals actually said that Colorado could not constitutionally enforce the electors' pledges, whereas the Washington Supreme Court upheld that. So you have kind of a difference in interpretation. So this is why this case is really important, because can't you imagine if it's a really close election, there's going to be even more pressure on some of those electors to go to their state capitals and vote for, let's assume that Donald Trump wins, to instead vote for Joe Biden or whatever might take place. So it's a more important case than maybe you would know by looking at how little coverage it's been getting right now from the mainstream press. Just before we take a break, though, my commentary today is about big tech and surveillance. And I point out that in other countries where they've been dealing with the pandemic, in South Korea, for example, they've been willing to use and have used credit card data, cell phone location data, surveillance camera footage, even announced that they would have infected individuals wearing electronic wristbands. Don't know that's going to happen in this country, as we talked about even yesterday with Representative Van Taylor. But I quote from Rachel Bovard saying that it's unlikely U.S. citizens would tolerate such intense mandatory measures. And she says that's where big tech comes in. And Seton Motley, who was writing as well, said, I went back and read George Orwell's book, 1984, and he said, when I look at that, the Orwell's fictional government was extraordinarily competent in its totalitarian imposition of technological power. But then he acknowledges something, and that is no government really is that competent. And so he said, enter the private sector, big tech. And that is what you're seeing is maybe government isn't going to be able to track down people and be big brother, but big tech is quite willing and has already stepped in. Google, for example, has been sharing all sorts of aggregate user location data with governments. Cell phone companies are developing various kinds of tracking apps for their phone. Many of these databases have collected GPS location data, and you've seen some of the graphs, even some I've held up here, where they show the decrease in the amount of vehicle traffic or foot traffic, and now the increase, and those kinds of things. And, of course, there have been talks of maybe getting immunity passports, which, again, may be something the government would do, but probably would just simply be shopped out to big tech. And so these are some real concerns. And in there, I even point out that you would assume that especially your personal health data would be kept private. And you would be wrong, because even the Department of Health and Human Services have talked about maybe backing off from some of the HIPAA rules, which is our health privacy law, and all of the rest. So this may be something we're going to have to pay more attention to. And in the commentary, I point out that one security expert says, when we looked at 9/11, things like the Patriot Act and a number of others would never have been implemented if we hadn't had a terrorist attack. But he's actually convinced that the effects of COVID-19 and the pandemic will be more dramatic in terms of public policy and surveillance than even the terrorist attacks of 9/11. So that's my commentary for today. My one for tomorrow is one that looks at what I call big tech censorship. And that is the fact that we also, at the same time in which big tech has been providing a lot more surveillance than many of us might feel comfortable with, it also has been making decisions about what can or cannot surface on their websites. And as we've pointed out before, of course, it's privately owned, but it's always been functioning as sort of a public forum. But now you've had Facebook announcing that it would remove posts intended to organize rallies that would be protesting maybe the government stay-at-home policies. And you've had some individuals with, say, Google and YouTube that have said, we merely need to remove things which we believe are problematic. And so those are all really important issues indeed. And Victor Davis Hanson, who we quote so often, talks about the fact that there have been certain almost untouchable sort of taboo areas where we couldn't even have a robust discussion. He says, for example, nearly every model that has been cited usually erred on the side of exaggerating morbidity, but he said to suggest in public that that was wrong was heresy. He said, if we've also found that the notion that everyone who died with COVID-19 died because of it, that maybe questioning that would be considered taboo. And he said, we're not even to question the weird formula of assessing, he says, the virus's morbidity by dividing the number of deaths only by the actual number of those who at the time have been tested positive for the infection. And so he points out that we have a growing number of taboo topics, and those are oftentimes being used sometimes by big tech to actually censor some of the material that is being posted. So if you find yourself saying, I'd like to learn a little bit more about some of this, first of all, we have the articles that are going to surface either today or tomorrow on big tech. We also, of course, have a booklet that we've made available on social media, and so all of that is available at the website, pointofview.net. And as we, over this last hour, have 2 hours, have spent some time talking about what you could do for your children and grandchildren, even as an evangelistic outreach for your neighborhood, go to the material with Child Evangelism Fellowship and go to the great material from Jimmy Page at Fellowship of Christian Athletes. And I think you're going to benefit tremendously from some of those resources indeed. Well, we're going to have a very good conversation tomorrow, which I'm looking forward to. Raymond Harris will be in studio as we talk about bringing this economy back, and we'll get into some other very important issues that you need to know about. So I hope that you'll visit the website, pointofview.net, and I hope that you will take the time to print out some of those materials, print them out, send them to other individuals, post them on your Facebook page. I think you'll benefit from that as well. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.